You've just entered the No Delusion Zone. I'm David Debato. Today, my very special guest is Timothy Ash. Tim is an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House in the UK. He's worked as a professional economist for more than 30 years, with 20 of those years in banking. Tim's specialization is in emerging European economics as related to fixed income investments. He writes and blogs extensively on economic challenges, and his articles are published in the Kyiv Post, Atlantic Council, Financial Times, United Business Journal, and many others. He's advised various governments on Ukraine-Russia policy and specifically on the impact of sanctions. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome back to the No Delusion Zone, Timothy Ash. Welcome back, Tim.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great to be here.
Well, again, thank you. As always, these are very, very interesting times. And as the man said, it gets curiouser and curiouser every day. I find it hard to keep up and to try to keep my spirits up, but I do. So let me just dive into it. Yesterday was a particularly depressing day in terms of people like myself who remember the Cold War very, very clearly. I'm speaking specifically about the UN and the fact that America joined Russia, of all things, in not voting for a resolution put forth by Ukraine to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, their full-scale invasion of Ukraine. United States, unbelievably, sided with Russia and would not vote against it. I was disgusted, and I actually did another podcast about just that specific article where I referenced Adlai Stevenson, if you remember him, not personally, but reading about him at least, where in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we almost came to nuclear war, Adlai Stevenson told the Soviet ambassador of the UN at the time that if he doesn't answer his direct question about whether the Soviet Union has missiles in Cuba, he's willing to wait till hell freezes over for an answer. And shortly after that, Russia did, of course, take their missiles out of Cuba and go back to Russia. And I was just commenting that, that was a true American. That was a true statesman. That was a civil servant, the exact kind that are being summarily dismissed right now by Elon Musk and Donald Trump for absolutely no reasons whatsoever. And it makes me really sad. It makes me really depressed. Those people are gone, and they're being replaced with apparatchiks. And so I don't want to keep going on. Did you read about that? I'm sure you did. What do you think about that? The United States voting with Russia, of all things, against Ukraine.
Well, it's pretty treacherous, right? And just the language used by Trump, about Putin and about Zelensky. I mean, calling Zelensky a dictator is extraordinary. Ukraine has had, I think, 6 presidents since the collapse of the Soviet Union and independence in 91. Since Putin took office, we've had 2, and one was the job share with Medvedev. Putin kills political opponents, right? I mean, a long list of them. Zelensky, after the full-scale invasion, chose to stay on despite considerable risk to his own life to defend the country. Russia subsequently has, obviously invaded, committed enormous number of war crimes. Butcher, Mariupol, ethnic cleansing of Ukrainians' population. It's crystal clear what Putin will do if he takes Ukraine. He will cleanse the Ukrainian population, right? That is the work of a dictator, and that Trump cannot call that out is just utterly extraordinary. And worse than that, calls Zelensky a democratically elected president a dictator. He's not having elections because under the Constitution, Ukraine is not able to have elections where there's martial law and mobilization for obvious reasons, right? And interestingly, there was a vote in the Ukrainian parliament, I think today, overwhelming 100% support for Zelensky in his, calling him, affirming his position as a democratically elected president. So this undermining of Zelensky, it's extraordinary. This is coming from a guy who challenged the the 2020 election as well, right? Capitol 6th, January 6th riots, all that kind of gig, right? I mean, it's sad. It's sad. It is treacherous, frankly. I mean, there's no other way. It's my personal view. I don't think there's any other way to explain it.
Well, I mean, it's the latest in what's known as projection. I mean, he's been practicing that his entire life, as far as I know, which is projecting his self-worth or lack thereof, his tendencies, his negative qualities, want to be dictator in this case on Zelensky. He does that all the time. He accused Biden of the same things that Trump has done. MAGA has taken up the same call. They accuse their enemies of everything that Trump has said and done. It's so clear to anybody who knows basic psychology, and has been said a million times, if it wasn't so tragic, it would be funny. And you're correct. Ukraine has been under martial law for the last several years. They cannot have elections. And I'm sorry, Mr. Trump. I would like you to have 1 millionth of the courage of Zelensky when he was literally threatened with his life when they had Russian hit squads out looking for him at the beginning of, or at the end of February in 2022, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, where they wanted to kill him or at least capture him and take him back to Moscow. He said, no, I don't need a ride. I need bullets. Let's see you do that, Trump. He gets me very angry. This is just a coward. He's a coward. All bullies are cowards. And Trump is the ultimate coward. But to call Zelensky a dictator, and what's worse, though, Tim, to be honest, is the fact that his cult members, his brainwashed sons of bitches in this political party they call Republicans, which are fascists, back him up. They don't call him out. They really don't. And did you see any of the recordings of Marco Rubio and Witkoff and the other clown in Riyadh where they were sucking up to Trump and saying how he was the only one who could have put this together and all the other nonsense?
Yeah, look, I mean, the reality is, I think whoever won the US presidential election, there would have been negotiations, whether it was Harris or Trump. As I think I probably said in other podcasts by yourself, Trump had a really good negotiating hand, right? He's given most of that away already. And I think Putin, the Russians can't believe their luck, right? I mean, what they've got here. I mean, and they've gone back to the maximalist claims on Ukraine, which is, essentially demilitarization, denazification essentially means a change in government in Kiev through an early election, which I think would risk the collapse of Ukrainian front lines, because demobilization, end of martial law will mean, a lot of young men naturally will leave the country, right? I mean, because it's tough to fight on the front lines, right? I mean, that's the harsh reality. So, and that would leave the collapse of Ukraine would leave the population subject to ethnic cleansing. Again, we've seen it. It's a fact. We've seen it across occupied territories. And that's why Ukrainians know they have no choice but to fight on if the ceasefire and peace deal offered doesn't give them security.
Well, I know you're not a military expert or a diplomat, but you are an economic expert, and I know you've probably been involved in countless negotiations when you worked in banking, in various economic forums. Let me just ask you this: what possible point or possible strategy do you think that the Trump negotiators are trying to achieve here with what you know so far of the hand that they've tipped in the negotiations thus far? What do you think their overall strategy is?
Well, as someone who's followed Russia for 40 years and has followed Putin throughout his career, Putin only respects strength. Every time anyone has offered him concessions, he's taken them and given nothing in exchange. So I'm sure, it's a naive negotiating strategy that somehow being nice to Putin will ensure that Putin delivers something nice in exchange. He won't. He wants the whole of Ukraine. That's absolutely clear. He views Ukraine as part of his sphere of influence. I think he'd love to have a Yalta II, sit down, great powers.
So you're saying, Tim, we'll take that up again. You're talking about well. Let me just say before you even start, you are an expert on Russia. You've studied them for decades, probably going back, I know, to the Soviet Union through the Cold War. What's the strategy? What's going on here? Like you were saying before this short break, Putin only respects strength. All Russians only respect strength. Russian leaders. So what do you think the strategy is here on the American side?
Well, I think it's naive. I mean, it's either, all these people are assets of the Russians all along. I mean, that's obviously been one concern. Or they just think that, being nice to Putin, he will deliver peace, long-term peace in Ukraine and stability in Europe. All the experience, I mean, I've had 40 years covering the Soviet Union, then Russia, and then all the period of Putin's period in office. Every time Putin has been offered concessions or appeasement, he's taken everything and given nothing. He respects strength, not weakness. And I think Trump is showing extreme weakness in the face of Putin. It looks, as I said, looks naive. I think Putin, Freudian slip. I think Putin will assume that Trump views the world like him in terms of great powers carve out their spheres of influence. He will think that trades can be done. The trade I think he thinks is on the table is Putin gets Ukraine, Trump gets Greenland, Canada, Panama Canal, you name it, in exchange. And for Putin obsesses with Ukraine. I mean, he wrote the essay in 21 before the invasion. It's not about NATO membership, not about NATO enlargement, never was. It's about the affront that Putin sees from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the creation of 14 other republics, 15 including Russia, that in the end showed Russian weakness, right? And that Ukrainians, because they are trying to build a state that has rule of law and democracy, and it's a hard battle because Russia has consistently tried to undermine Ukraine and destabilize it from within. But because Ukrainians want something different to autocracy, Putin sees that as a threat because he knows most Russians actually, when presented with a choice, would probably want to live in Western Europe, not in Russia. They want to live in a normal European country where, they can express their views and opinions and they can participate in politics and they don't get arrested or killed for doing that, right? So that's why Putin has a problem with Ukraine. It's nothing about NATO. And I think the Trump administration just don't get that. They don't get, I mean, in the end, this is a battle, autocracy and kleptocracy versus democracy. I mean, that's the harsh reality, right? And the Ukrainians are fighting for democracy, right? And, I guess the worry here is that Trump and Putin impose some kind of ceasefire on Ukraine without security guarantees, ensuring that Ukraine is not sustainable without security guarantees. Investment will not flow into the country. You'll see economic and social failure and then political failure in Ukraine that Putin will take advantage of to take the whole country. I mean, that's the danger. And I think that the Trump administration just can't understand or get that, right? Or don't really care. That's the reality. They have other priorities. They're after a quick ceasefire deal, the low-hanging fruit, easy wins from their perspective. They don't really care much about the detail. And in the end, they've surrendered Ukraine to Putin. And that means, inevitably, ethnic cleansing in Ukraine, which Trump will be responsible for. Blood will be on his hands. That will destabilize Europe. The destabilization of Europe will be because of Trump. We're already, I think, seeing the collapse of NATO. I mean, this has been the mainstay of European and transatlantic security for 75 years since the end of the Second War. I mean, you mentioned, I think, the UN Security Council vote. I mean, I think this is the first time since 1945 that the US has not voted alongside the European allies. Pretty extraordinary. And I think Americans need to think, what does that mean? What does the end of NATO mean for them? Now, they may not care at the moment, but if they think that ultimately, the US is probably going to get in a hegemonic battle with China for global supremacy, and that's what certainly many people in the US Defense Department under the Biden administration, Trump administration think there's going to be, their NATO allies are not going to be there. That's the reality. Why would European allies put their necks on the line for the US on its number one national security interest, which seemingly is China, when the Trump administration has thrown Europe under the bus to Russia? Russia is the number one national security threat to Europe. I mean, for US listeners, let's just think about this. I live in the UK. I'm British, right? Lots of focus on weapons of mass destruction. The UK, when the Americans asked for our help in Afghanistan and Iraq, remember the weapons of mass destruction story, we came and fought alongside Americans, right? Many British lives were lost in support of the US after 9/11, obviously also in Iraq. We've had weapons of mass destruction used on the streets of the UK twice by the Putin administration, Litvinenko and the Skripal Salisbury poisonings, right? We've had it. I mean, so where's the US going to be now going forward, against this bad actor that has deployed weapons of mass destruction against and continues to act in an extremely bad, malign way? Cyber attacks on our energy infrastructure, attacks on our cabling. I mean, the US under Trump has decided, it doesn't care about NATO, it doesn't care about Europe. Fine. Well, we will remember. Europe will remember when push comes to shove and when the US asks for help again. I don't think Europe will be there, right? And Europe, I mean, Trump seems to have decided that he values a relationship with Russia, which is a $2 trillion economy, much more than Europe, which is a $25 trillion economy, so 12 times as big, in some future contest with China. I mean, Europe is now getting its act together, or will get its act together in terms of the military-industrial complex. We all agree Europe has not spent enough on defence. UK's just announced a big increase in its own defence spending, a plan to go to 2.5% of GDP to 3% of GDP. I think it will go further than that. Europe will get its military-industrial complex into gear because it has to. That's clear cut now. Now, initially we will be a market for US military products because we lack the capacity at the moment. We will get our capacity up. We will then be a competitor to the US, and a significant competitor. And we could then be a supplier to the US of military equipment going forward. We can help the US build destroyers and frigates and tanks, all the things it's possible, drones, all the things it's likely to need in a future contest with China. Multiples greater ability than Russia. We need to sell, what we bring to the table better, I think, to the US and the Trump administration. But I think the US, Trump in particular, and the US need to think what it's losing by this approach to Europe and approach to its allies in NATO. I think allies, that have been tested in war, I think bring lots to the table.
There's so much to unpack there. Let me just say a couple of things about what you were speaking about right now. As you know, after 9/11, the only time that Article 5 has been enacted was after 9/11 and the attack on New York and Washington. And NATO enacted Article 5. They came to our aid. You mentioned the UK supporting the United States, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. I served alongside UK units in Iraq. But even more ironically, Tim, I served with a military medical unit from Ukraine in Iraq. They came. They helped us. They didn't have to. They actually worked on American soldiers who were wounded in Iraq. So just think about that. They came to our aid when we asked, as did many NATO nations during that time. And here we are stabbing them in the back, specifically Ukraine, but NATO. In general, it's a disgrace. Let me ask you this, and you alluded to this briefly before, and I have to bring it up because it's important. And many people, of course, are talking about this. There was a recent article about from I think it was an intelligence officer from Kazakhstan who alleges that Trump is an asset, was an asset, was turned in 1988, I believe he said. In Moscow, has been an asset ever since. He did not provide any other evidence, documentary or otherwise. This has been said before, alluded to before. I go back and forth personally about thinking whether or not that's true. I just happen to think, for the most part, that Trump is just a greedy son of a bitch. He doesn't care about anybody, and he just goes where he thinks he can make the most money and look the best. But I'm not ruling out that he might be a Russian asset because, as again you briefly alluded to, what really could be the reason for this total quick 180 to really kissing Putin's ass and spouting Kremlin talking points, giving Putin absolutely everything he asked for, when he started this war. What's your personal or professional opinion on whether or not Trump is actually compromised by Moscow?
Well, I obviously have no evidence of that, aside from the fact that, as I said, Trump went into negotiations with Putin over Ukraine with all the cards, all the advantage, right? Putin was weak, not doing very well in the war. I mean, 3 years into a war that Putin was no nearer to winning. Like, he needed negotiations. Trump had the ability to increase military supplies to Ukraine, increase sanctions on Russia. No US troops have been killed, no blood lost. The treasure, I mean, unfortunately, Trump has been telling alternative facts. I mean, I noticed he met Macron yesterday. He spoke about $350 billion of US support for Ukraine.
Bullshit. Not true.
Not true. The total support so far of the Western alliance given and committed is about $350 billion, of which $115 billion is from the US. Big number, true. But Europe has given 150, and there's about another 120 pledged by Europe. So basically, 2/3 of support for Ukraine is from Europe and 1/3 from Russia. Fact. So I don't know where he gets his.
And Tim, how much of that has come back to U.S. contractors already?
Well, I'd say half at least of US support ends up staying back in the US economy. A lot of it is equipment that sat in deserts in the US doing nothing particularly, whatever. So, so Trump had a very strong negotiating hand. He could have negotiated, we can debate whether or not the war is ultimately about NATO membership for Ukraine, whether Ukraine had any real NATO perspective in the end. But Trump could have negotiated around that. He could have used that as leverage with Putin. Security guarantees could have used that as leverage. Territory could have used it as leverage. Sanctions could have used it as leverage. He's given everything away. He's told Putin, you can have everything you want. And Putin's now asking for more. It's utterly ridiculous for a guy who's supposed to be of the art of the deal. Putin probably can't believe his luck that he's gone into a negotiation with people that have already given him everything he's wanted, even before they've sat down. And the other remarkable thing, I mean, the last couple of weeks we've been looking at the minerals deal that is the Ukrainians and the Bush Trump administration were firstly negotiating. Having given Putin everything, he's now charging the Ukrainians for it. Utterly remarkable. A 50% claim on everything in Ukraine in terms of minerals and resources from state-owned enterprises going forward, for forcing the Ukrainians to concede everything to. I mean, the Ukrainians could do that themselves without any peace process driven by Trump.
Right? Well, yeah, he's added on to this, and correct me if I'm wrong, not only the $500 billion in the rare earth, but as you said, additional, I think he's now asking for 50% of their natural gas, their oil revenues, and also all the revenues that come through their ports in perpetuity, forever, to the United States. This is something that even a mafia don would blush at asking. This is a protection racket. Give us this or else. And it's just so blatant, Tim, and it's just horrible. I mean, I don't know your thoughts on that. I'm just, it's beyond words.
I think the danger for the US from this is, it sends a terrible message to allies and partners going forward that the US simply cannot be relied on. Why would anyone want to work with the US going forward?
Is NATO going to disengage from the US? I mean, not now. They can't. But I mean, within the next couple of years, are you going to see a real separation, Tim? Or are we going to see a real separation in terms of European security and possibly even economic ties? Where's this going?
I think NATO is dead. I mean, it's a really hard thing to say, harsh thing to say, but I think the consensus now in Europe, we're hearing it increasingly from politicians and think tanks, is they realize the US cannot be trusted. It's not willing to stand behind its allies in Europe. We need alternatives, right? And we will look for alternatives. That means Europe has to look to China, to Turkey, to the Gulf states for alternatives, right? And, again, America needs to think through what that means for its defense going forward. We have to develop our own military industrial complex to rival the US. We can't rely on US launch code in its missile systems. The US is now an unreliable partner, right?
Can't rely on US intelligence. We got Tulsi Gabbard, the earpiece of the Kremlin as the director of national security, national intelligence.
Absolutely. I mean, it was sad to hear her talking through Putin talking points about elections in Ukraine. I think we've already spoken about it, but she was repeating this mantra that Zelensky is not a Democrat. It's utterly ridiculous comment to make.
Yeah, right? I mean, I hate to keep saying it. I really mean this, Tim. I sound like a broken record, but after a while, this is so nightmarish that it's Stephen King couldn't have written a horror book like this. It's just unbelievable. So I don't know. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you're right. I mean, I believe that NATO's dead, and I also believe that the transatlantic economic ties are going to be pretty much dead as soon as possible. Why would they trust us not only for their security, but to trust us for anything? If they want to strong arm Ukraine, which they are, why wouldn't they strong arm any nation within the EU?
Yeah, I mean, look. Again, the overwhelming consensus in Europe, and I've just been on a call, a think tank call with colleagues from Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, France, and the 100% overwhelming message is we can't rely on the US. We have to now go our own way. And again, I mean, US troops fought bravely in Europe in the Second World War. We were allies. We fought in the Far East, with American allies. We had common interests, common values. That's kind of all gone out of the window, right? I mean, just imagine that as a US listener, right? I mean, it's just extraordinary. It really is. We could have never imagined such a worst case scenario as this. And look, Europe will survive. We're a $25 trillion economy. We will get our act together. We'll have other options, right? But as I said, when the US comes knocking on our door for assistance, if there's another 9/11 style scenario, or if, God help us, there's a US-China conflict over Taiwan or anything like this, why would Europe help the US given in our hour of need, which is absolutely now with Russia attacking Europe and the Americans walk away? Like, why would we help the US in what it sees as its national interest? So again, you talk about the Five Eyes and, talking to UK government-related people, they have major worries now about sharing intelligence with the US. Right. I know the US is a huge intelligence machine, and we value also the information sharing. But I think US allies globally will be thinking twice about what information they give to this Trump administration.
I wouldn't give anything. I wouldn't give the time of day to the Americans right now with the compromises within both national intelligence and the Pentagon. They'd have to be crazy. We've got Pete Hegseth, as the head of the Pentagon. We've got Kash Patel in charge of our domestic counterintelligence service, the FBI, and old Tulsi, the Kremlin Gabbard. director of national intelligence. Let me ask you this. MAG is made up of a lot of low information individuals, but not at the top. The people who actually run the government or around Trump are very intelligent people. At least they have formal education. They're graduates of elite universities and so forth. They know the story. They know what's going on just from a purely economic point of view, Tim. Why would they do what they're doing, which is to essentially burn down, just sever all the historic relationships, economic relationships now with their largest trading partners? Why would they do that, knowing America, is going to suffer economically because they're not stupid? Or am I wrong? Are they actually that stupid when it comes to something like that because they're members of a cult and they can't see beyond their brainwashing?
Well, look, I mean, I think there is some philosophical basis for what's happening in the US. I think we're seeing almost a CEO takeover. I think their model, their view is that Western liberal market democracy is now a vulnerability and a weakness with this hegemonic battle with China, right? And they think there needs to be a total reconstruct of governance and governments in the US, a centralization of decision making, a weakening of the traditional democratic kind of institutional framework in the US, and maybe a move to a more autocratic system, right? I mean, you see it in the Gulf states, for example, how they're very effective at running countries. I think some within that oligarchic circle around Trump, think there needs to be a reset, and it makes a stronger, more effective executive government. And one person, one vote, I think counts for less, right? So I think we're seeing centralization, we're seeing a concentration of power, control of the judiciary, the military, the executive, the legislature in the US. I mean, it's quite disturbing. I mean, for someone who spent their career looking at, autocratic regimes, I mean, we've seen this act play out before in other countries, right? I mean, I'd be very nervous as a US citizen.
Well, I don't sleep that well today, Tim. I'll let you know.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting, to hear JD Vance. JD Vance comes to Europe at the Munich Security Conference and talks about lack of free speech in Europe. I mean, quite extraordinary. I mean, I live here. I don't see any of that, right? I mean, yes, we had a terrible situation last summer in the UK where we had race riots. No other way to explain it. White supremacists were looking to burn down mosques and hotels with people, human beings in them, right? And we had social media promoting that.
Very often supported by the GRU, by the way. I know for a fact.
Extremism, race hate. I mean, it was extraordinary, right? Now, the government had to act, for social stability. I mean, and we had no choice. What alternative? Otherwise, we would have seen, a completely out of control situation with people dying. It wasn't unreasonable to act against those people who were promoting race hate and law breaking through social media. And we did act, and it stabilized the situation, and now it's calmer in the UK. To call that, I think, it's a fine line between free speech and incitement of racial hatred and law breaking. I personally, I don't think you should have a right to inspire other people to kill. Right.
Or to overthrow the government.
Correct. So, I don't think it was unreasonable what we did for JD Vance to come to the UK and lecture Europe about free speech. I mean, people who criticize, well, anyway.
I hear you. Look, JD Vance was just upset, as was Elon Musk, that in Germany today, in 2025, they do not allow people to do this in public. He thinks that this is, abridging their freedom of speech, and he's opposed to that. He thinks they should be able to give the Nazi salute and to speak fondly of Nazis, and to say that anything that tries to stifle that type of speech is, attacking freedom of speech. That's exactly what they said.
Look, the US may be a long way from Europe, but Germany has those laws for a reason, right? It has the Nazi past. They were responsible for the Holocaust. They were responsible not just. Actually, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was responsible for the deaths of 60 million Europeans in the Second World War. Jews, gypsies, ethnic minorities. Many Soviets died in concentration camps, Poles, Belarusians, Baltics. We had that terrible past, right? We had extreme right-wing parties who promoted that very same race hate. I don't think it's unreasonable to have bans on parties like that. Anyway.
They only want bans, Tim, on speech that they support, which in this case is the extreme right. It's very obvious. Most people don't want to say that. I say it. A lot of people here do say it online on podcasts. Extreme right-wing speech is all that they're talking about when they talk about freedom of speech. That's it. That's all they mean.
Sure, and they're very quick. If you believe in DEI, diversity, they're very quick to close that down, as we're seeing now. It's quite interesting that some of the first actions of Doge has been to restrict access of US State Department employees buying publications such as The Economist, which is that far right newspaper in the UK. They're cracking down on opinion that they don't like, and then banging this lack of free speech in Europe. It's completely ridiculous.
No, they're the ultimate in hypocrisy. I want to get to an article you published very recently. I think it was about 4 or 5 days ago in CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis. And the title of your article was "Humble the Bankers and Give Russia's Cash to Ukraine." Now, that's an idea that's been batted around for years, hasn't really been done yet. Tell us why you think that is, and talk about the article.
Look, many of those people who know me well, I'm banging this line for 2.5 years. Trump has pushed this agenda that the US has paid too much to support Ukraine in its defense against Russian aggression, right? And, it has provided $115 billion of support. The Ukrainians are very glad for that. But, it is remarkable that we have $330 billion of Russian taxpayer money in our banking systems that has been immobilized by Western governments and is just sitting there doing nothing, while our governments are quite happy to write big taxpayer checks to support Ukraine, right? Why isn't Russian money being used to fund Ukraine's defense and fund its reconstruction and recovery? So basically, unfortunately, European governments don't do themselves any favors. They've been blocking this for stupid reasons. Interesting, in the UK, we have a debate at the moment about increasing defense spending. I mentioned we're looking to go to 2.5% of GDP. It's difficult. We have our economic situation is not great. We have fiscal constraints. I argued in that piece that actually we have over 20 billion pounds in sterling immobilized in the UK. I argue that in the short term, we could fund our own increase in defense spending and to help the Ukrainians in their own defense by moving from immobilization to taking that money and using it to fund our own defense and the Ukrainians' defense. Legally, it's not difficult to do. It's a political decision. There's a whole legal argument been made by Bob Zolik and the team, Bob Zolik, ex-World Bank chief. The legal case, I think, is pretty clear now. It's a political decision. European governments need to act. There's about 170 billion in Belgium, 170 billion euros of money in Belgium. There's about $250 billion of Central Bank of Russia assets, Russian taxpayer money assets in Europe. We could sign this over immediately, literally within days, with a political decision. We could then allocate it, as I said, to Ukraine's defense, to our own defense. European countries could be very clever. They could create a fund for Europe's defense and democracy. We could, if you want to appeal to Trump's ego, you could name it the Trump Fund for European Defense and Democracy. And we could pledge to buy US weapons for Ukraine's defense from that money, from that fund. Get the Russians to pay for Europe's defense. Why are we not doing it? It's European bureaucracy and inertia. Actually, to be honest, the Brits, the Japanese, the Canadians, and the Americans could have done it themselves already. It's about 100 billion in our jurisdictions. Now that funds Ukraine for around a year. So wherever the Europeans have done, we could do it ourselves. Trump himself could do it. Trump could designate, I think there's about 30 to 40 billion dollars of Russian money in the US. He could sign an executive order tomorrow to take that money and to pay America off itself, right, for the money that has been used to fund the Ukrainians. So why isn't that being done? Why is Trump still protecting Russian taxpayers at the expense of American taxpayers? Why are Western countries in general protecting Russian taxpayers over our own taxpayers? So anyway, I wrote a paper. I've been writing for 2.5 years on this issue, telling everyone that we're idiots if we don't use this money. We clearly are idiots, because 2.5 years later, the money's still sitting there.
Well, they don't have the political will. I get that. I think we all get that. Why? After 3 years, 2.5 years, what have you, with the dire situation being what it is now, even worse than it was just a few weeks ago, why isn't there the political will to use this frozen Russian asset?
Well, it's interesting. You speak to politicians. I speak to British politicians and I explain to them this. And they said immediately, it's like a light bulb moment. They suddenly get it. Wow, this is amazing. Let's do it. And then the order goes down to the bureaucracy, our treasuries, UK Treasury, US Treasury, French Treasury, ECB. And they figure out all these excuses not to do it. And they're all very weak excuses. I've written extensively on it. There is no argument against that counters the danger of not doing it, which is Ukraine's defeat in this war, which would be an existential threat to European security and defense and democracy. We have to do it. We should have done it a long time ago. Our politicians our bureaucracies have sat on their backside and said it can be done. It should be done now, within days, within weeks. We should do it, and that would increase pressure on Putin himself, because it would send a signal that we are funding Ukraine properly. They will have resources to sustain a longer conflict and inflict more damage on Russia itself. So better for Putin to come to the table and negotiate a fair and just peace for Ukraine now, not a year down the line.
Well, and I've said for years too that I'm sorry, the European leaders, for the most part, are cowards. They just are. This war could be over. What I said about Trump, that's a foregone conclusion. He's the biggest coward. But what you're saying just proves the cowardice. What are they afraid of? Putin's going to sue them. He's going to launch an invasion on a European country. Oh, he already did that. There's a war in Ukraine. I mean, what are they afraid of? I don't want you to answer that, because it's impossible to know. I think the cowardice just runs very, very deep. I've written myself about the deep business ties in Russia with some European leaders, not just the elected ones, but the CEOs. I do believe that that's a part of it, but we're way past that. At least we should be. Europe needs to be way past that. You are in, when I say you, Europe, in an existential crisis because of what my president did. They need to get off their ass. And they need to do what you just said really, really quick. They could fund the entire defense of Ukraine, not to mention start the entire defense of Europe based on the money that's frozen.
No, totally. I mean, the reality is, the Biden administration also had its faults. It did provide support for Ukraine, but not enough. It drip-fed support to Ukraine, both military support and financial support, as the Ukrainians argue. They gave them enough to sustain the war, but not win the war. I mean, the Biden administration, I think, was fearful of what a Ukrainian victory and a Russian defeat looked like. We shouldn't be scared about that. We shouldn't be scared about defeating a brutal dictator. We shouldn't be worried about what Russia looks like after its defeat. Interestingly, Timothy Schneider, who I think has written some of the best books on dictatorship, and particularly his book called Bloodlands, which is about Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, how it exterminated millions of people in Central Europe in the Second World War. He argues actually that, if you look at, the empires need to be defeated ultimately to move on. He looks at, I guess, the decline of the UK and European colonizers. And in a way, for economic development, in a way, they need to get over their colonial period. And Russia ultimately is a colonizer. And it needs to suffer defeat in Ukraine to be able to change itself from within, right? And a defeat in Ukraine would ultimately be good for Russia. It would refresh. Russia has a hang-up about its colonial past. That's what we're seeing in Ukraine. It needs to move on from that, like the UK has in terms of its colonies, like the USA, for example. We figured out, we're not. I was Ricky Gervais, who I think he was at the Golden Globes, and when he presented, he started his session by saying, "Hello, my name's Ricky Gervais. I'm from the UK. We used to run the world before you guys turned up." And I think, that, it just suggests that, the UK now realizes its place in the world, right? Russia, I think, also needs to realize its place in the world. And, the world's no longer about great empires and spheres of influence and subjugating poor colonial subjects.
Well, I just did a podcast about that topic, and my guest, a Russian dissident, said that the only way that that's going to happen is with a crushing Russian defeat. It's not going to happen peacefully. There's not going to be any peaceful Russian transition, any peaceful Russian transition of power to a democratic president or Duma. No, he said it's going to have to be another revolution or civil war, or better yet, a crushing defeat of the Russian military in Ukraine, which would then probably spur a civil war and or revolution. He said that's the only way it's going to happen. And I agree with you. He pretty much said what you said, that they need to be defeated. The Russian Empire, the current Russian Empire under Tsar Putin, needs to be crushed. They need to be defeated, because if they're not, they are going to continue. I think anybody with any brains Trump doesn't have any brains, but anybody that knows Russia at all, and you know them very well, knows he's not going to stop, especially if he's handed Ukraine by Trump. He's not going to stop, and it's going to be all the worse for Europe after that.
Oh, I totally agree.
So let's leave it on that very, very optimistic, pleasant note, because that's where we're at today. I hate to say it, but any closing thoughts about what you think is going to happen in the next few weeks? Because I can't predict the next few minutes. It's happening too fast for me.
Well, look, I think the danger is that a ceasefire is imposed on Ukraine by Russia and the US, a ceasefire that is not sustainable, that ultimately leaves Ukraine insecure, that will destabilize Ukraine, that elections are forced upon Ukraine. And we see, again, demobilization, and we see a collapse of Ukrainian front lines, which will hand a victory to Putin, and we'll see millions of Ukrainians moving west, which will destabilize Europe. And the prospect is Ukraine now is a military power in Europe, and the combination of Russia and Ukraine, the military-industrial complex, will be a huge threat to the security of Europe. So, really, really worrying times. It's worrying that you have a Trump administration that seems to be employing negotiators who really have little perspective on Europe, little real understanding, apart from a real understanding of Russia, what Putin is, what Putin wants, apart from, access to Trump's golf cart.
I agree. They have very little perspective, and if they do, they've swallowed it. They've swallowed the Kool-Aid, actually, because they're now members of the cult. And people like Marco Rubio was a strong anti-Putin member of the Senate. He was an anti-Russian and Soviet Union type of an American. He knows the danger. That's what's so galling, so aggravating about all of this, is the hypocrisy and the fast turnaround to the cult of Trump, and throwing Ukraine and NATO, Europe, under the bus just to please their cult leader. It's disgusting, but we can go on and on about that. Listen, Tim, thank you so much. Timothy Ash, as always, it's been a pleasure. You take care of yourself, and let's talk again soon. You take care and stay safe and stay sane.
Yeah, thank you very much. Cheers, then.
Cheers.